Hello, and welcome to the second part of Levels of Being. As in the first part, I will reference several of the many drawings Eugene Halliday completed during the course of the lecture which he gave in Liverpool in the early 1960s. Levels of Being, Part 2. I was talking previously about the relations of man's awareness to the necessary laws of motion. Let's consider a very simple one that we've done before. Motion is either open motion or closed. There's open motion going along and it never closes itself, so it's just a continuous travelling through space. But the closed motion goes round and bites itself on the tail. Now, necessarily, the one that travels in a straight line and never closes anything can never bring anything to be. It cannot make anything. Make means close the substance. The make in the Makeless Maiden Mary, or Immaculate Mary, Unspotted Mary, means the substance, the Mary, Mare, or cosmic ocean, which itself has no closure within it. If we consider the virgin substance, that is the substance of force absolute, with no closures whatsoever, then we are considering the meaning of the symbol of the Immaculate Mary. The infinite ocean of power, considered without any rotating forces in it, and therefore without closed forces, is immaculate or unspotted, and that of itself must consist, because the absolute power is sentient, in a ceaseless travelling without arriving. It is a perpetual travelling without coming to a term. Term implies a closure. And when it says in the Bible that God so loved the world that he gave his Son, it means that there was something peculiar about this absolute unclosed motion, which to this motion itself seemed unsatisfactory. Unsatisfactory means not being making. Unsatisfactory, not being making. Being means closure. If we imagine this absolute ocean of infinite sentiency, it must feel itself eternally unsatisfied, because it is a going without an arriving. It is a seeking without any finding. Now, if it is to become satisfied, it must turn, it must close itself. And when it closes itself, it has done two things. It has found for itself an object, but it has restricted the amount of force involved in the closure. Now, this is the very beginning of dialectics. This is the very beginning of the statement, if you do a thing, you will simultaneously do the opposite. If you know that fact, you won't mind doing the opposite at the same time. If you don't know it, you will find yourself locked up when all you wanted to do was play about. Every time you commit yourself into a situation, you're looking for some satisfaction. But if you don't analyze the necessary relations in that field, you will put your energy into it, looking for the satisfaction, and in the act of inwinding your energy into it, you will lock yourself up. So, the person who wants to be important in politics must study certain things. As he succeeds, so duties will be put upon him. Now, he may not go in for the duties, he may go in for the job, for what it can give him, or perhaps his reputation, or increased earning level. Whatever he goes into it for, he will find that he doesn't get that thing only. He gets the very opposite. He raises his level in order to become freer and to get more power, and in the act of raising his level, he finds that he is less free and has less power, because the higher he goes, the more responsibility he gets. Because responsibility is the ability to respond. So when he gets right to the top, he finds he gets absolute responsibility. And absolute responsibility means responsibility for absolutely everything there is. So if a man climbs to the very top level seeking absolute power, he discovers, when he gets there, that he is now in charge of the universe, and he will have to run it on the same kind of lines that he complained about when he was at a lower level. Now, not to see this in the first instance causes striving for high power. But as soon as you see that, the increase of knowledge increases responsibility, puts restraint upon you as well as freeing you, because in freeing you from the level of the dead mineral, it puts you in restraint at the vegetable level, because you are now subjected to the pursuit of moist and warmth. If you feel free yourself from that, and become an animal, then you can run about, find yourself restricted to the terrain where your dinner grows. So if you free yourself from the animal and become an empirical man, you find yourself freed from those things and simultaneously bound to try to discover more about them. Because if you want to get your dinner where you want it, when you want it, you'll have to learn to dig in one country and transport the produce to another country. So the more you raise your level, the greater your responsibility, and the more restricted you are. When you get up to the level of necessary concepts, you are very, very restricted indeed. And there's only one thing left for you to do there. That's either shoot yourself or go back to the mineral or assume absolute responsibility. If you do so, then you find that you will do certain things freely, but they will not be the things that you thought you would have done when you were down at the level of the empirical man. The empirical man can't see very far, so he makes a big bang, and the big bang irradiates the atmosphere, and the radiations bite back at the empirical man. So he is forced by facts to reevaluate the situation, because he hadn't enough necessary thought in him to see the consequences of his act before he did it. Now we are to place all the subjects that we know somewhere on this graph, and know that when we do so, we are in fact passive to the absolute. Now, if we've got a circle in the top level of the necessary logic, or to the absolute and necessary, if we are at the empirical level, or to the absolute, the necessary, and the empirical, if we are at the animal desire level, or to these four, if we're at the vegetable level, or to those five, if we were at the mineral level. So, although raising the level increases the responsibility, not raising it increases passivity and slavery to other beings on the way up. Now, the fact is that you cannot rely at all upon any of the beings here to do what you want them to do, if they are above you. And as their level is frequently not that of the absolute, and therefore they haven't got absolute responsibility yet, they will not have a sense of responsibility towards you. And therefore, if you wish to escape the consequences of their erroneous and rash actions, you have no alternative but to try to raise your level right through the whole series. Now, this is a dialectical process, either or. Either you stay at the bottom and let everybody kick you about, or you climb up. As soon as you climb into the level of the plant, you can feel. Now you've got pleasure pains. When you climb into the animal level, you can have people depriving you of motion in the pursuit of your desires. When you rise into the empirical level, people might contradict your empirical results, write rude books about your conclusions, like you find in the field of empirical science. Historically, all the discoverers of all the inventions are busy writing insulting books about each other and proving that not that man, but another man discovered the very thing. At every level there is warfare. Only the absolute runs through the lot and supports them all. Let's look at what happens psychologically. If we interpret this in terms of feeling, if you are at the absolute level, you feel free. But you also feel in that fact that it would be a good thing to create, because at that level you are spotless, you are immaculate, and you have no object. This is the objectlessness of the sage, the Taoist sage, who wills nothing at all. Now, we know that Taoism in China, taken seriously, actually stopped them developing altogether. And it wasn't until an atom bomb dropped on a Japanese city that the East woke up to the fact that they'd become passive, because of this concept of the absolute disinterestedness in finites of the absolute itself. The whole of Oriental religion climbed up to the absolute, identified with the absolute, and then sat down and let an ant colony be built around its ears. When the Europeans, who were at the empirical level, came and found the yogi surrounded by an ant hill, they first took out their Brownie No. 2 cameras and photographed him, and then they picked him up on a shovel and put him in a museum. He had become passive, in fact, to these other men. Which means that in climbing up to his absolute and then staying there, and yet leaving his mineral body accessible in the earth, he had been guilty of a little bit of bad logic. In terms of feeling, then, we have the absolute feels free and is free, but it feels inside itself a tendency to create forms. And this tendency then passes it down to produce the absolute first finited being, the necessary logical being. Now, as soon as that's been put, the feeling of searching for something is fulfilled. You then feel quite happy with necessary truths, with necessary laws of motion. You don't see people at all at the level of an ordinary man. You don't see a lover and his lass. You see a couple of packets of necessary motion. And you can see precisely what these packets of necessary motion are necessarily going to do in a minute, and they'll get moved on by another necessary packet called a bobby. Now, as soon as they see these necessaries, they are regarding the whole thing at the level of motion, and they feel perfectly secure, because the whole thing is absolutely necessary. There is no empirical search. There is no animal desire. There's no merely vegetative waiting. And there is no inertia. But there is a continuous penetration of the situation with necessary propositions of logic. Spinoza's philosophy is at this level, where he sees even God himself under the necessary laws of his own being. So the absolute feels free, but feels that it would be a good idea to make something. As soon as it's made something, what it has made is necessary laws of motion. And at that level, the being feels that it's quite all right. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, because all the motions in the world are necessary. But as soon as he identifies with the empirical man, he goes under the law of accident, because he doesn't know then what stimulus is going to appear at what time. He doesn't know whether he's going to be hit in the eye or the ear or the nose. One of his 5 senses or more will be stimulated and he will have no control over it. So at this moment, his feeling changes. And the feeling, instead of being one of absolute security in the necessary laws of motion, becomes one of continuous insecurity. The empirical man is in perpetual terror because he does not yet know enough. He doesn't know the necessary, therefore he has no security. So he runs about rapidly piling up data in the attempt to get that security. The next stage of involvement is when we come down to the animal level. And there, instead of pursuing knowledge as such, like the empirical man, we feel in us the pursuit of the desirable and the avoidance of the undesirable. This is a totally different experience, quite valid at its own level. Now we've lost the feeling of being free, we've lost the feeling of necessary, we've lost the feeling of the pursuit of knowledge as such, and we are now merely pursuing the desire. Which is like the average man on a Saturday night. Really, he doesn't really want to think. He's merely pursuing something far better. He lubricates himself up with a few pints to get the engine working properly before he actually goes off on the chase. Now, when the next level is reached, this desire thing lapses from consciousness, and you simply become aware that you're waiting for something to happen. You wish something would happen. You're not doing anything about it, but you sit there vegetating, as we say, waiting for the sun to shine or your boots to get wet so that you can grow yourself a root. This stage is a genuine experience inside. And the level below that is the level where you don't even wait. This state we find in certain mental cases, a catatonic state, where the being just sits without moving at all, with no signs of sentiency, with no responses, quite anesthetic. You can stick a pin in him and he won't move. And he's now like a mineral. All these states exist inside us. And as far as the empirical man is concerned, a stimulus from outside hitting him on one of the sense organs can knock him down into one of the other levels. Now, you can't do this on the man who knows the necessary laws of motion, but it can do it on the empirical man. The empirical man is full of information, formal, and the information is caused by the knocking of the matter of his sense organs, producing feeling states and then desires, which have attached to them formal records. So that if a man eats an orange, he gets a sense stimulus of satisfaction. The empirical man doesn't think it's necessary. Consequently, he tends to go down to the animal level and search for another orange. So every sense stimulus hitting the empirical man drives him about. So really, he's not much better than the animal. The animal has a smaller vocabulary and therefore a more restricted response system to the empirical man. But he's still driven about. Now, we've concerned especially with empirical man at the moment because we can say roughly that not many parts of the being of man today are really preoccupied with necessary knowledge. If you say that necessary knowledge would mean that all the things you're supposed to know about you actually understand, the necessary laws of motion, and you actually understand the necessary laws of motion that cover them. If you know something about mechanics, you must understand the necessary behavior of a lever, of shearing actions, of tensions, of stresses and strains, and so on. If you know something about electronics, you must know the necessary motions of them before you can put your circle in that field. Not the empirical, probable motions. So in any field at all that you care to mention, only if you know the necessary laws governing it can you really put yourself in there. In psychology, it would mean not that you think the soul is a feeling being, which it is, but that you actually know the necessary laws governing its feelings. You know that if it contracts in a certain way, it does so necessarily according to certain laws. And you know that these contractions will necessarily produce within it certain feelings. If you can actually say so truthfully, then you are at that level. If you can, of course, and if you can do it, you've really not much more work to do. In fact, you've only one work left to do. When you've got all your subjects raised up to the level of the necessary, all you have to do is throw them all away and enter into the absolute and become unspotted. Until that time, we are concerned with how to raise the empirical man to that level. Now, the empirical man has collected a lot of data, most of it erroneous. You can see that it's erroneous because most of modern science is still declared to be empirical. It does not act upon the necessary. Only very, very few, small number of high mathematicians think in terms of the necessary. And everybody below that level is thinking in terms of the probable only. When we look at the laws of motion and we lift them up one stage higher, we can see why we like and why we dislike certain propositions. Remember that the Absolute has produced a universe simply by involving itself, and it is passing out of itself as well. So, this is the diagram of Taurus in the zodiac. And it means the entrance and exit of the absolute force. Just like the sign of Aries itself means the absolute force. We add this sign to a circle, the sign of Aries to the sign of the circle, and it gives us Taurus. When that energy comes in, the fact of it turning round creates necessarily a situation in which energy within its bound, it is bound, and it's bound to rotate. So as soon as the energy coming in closes itself and goes round again, then the whole mass of force inside there rotates. Now, a rotation of a motion which cannot stop and cannot go to the dead center. This again is a necessary statement. So the motion which is coming in, spiraling in closer and closer towards the center, cannot reach it. It cannot drive in so far only. And then it has to come out again. This really is the secret glyph of the whole universe. And we'll simplify it like this. We go in and in and shoot out. Now, that is the graph, the symbol of the polarity of the universe. There's an absolute force unclosed that is coming in, winding in towards the centre, which it can't reach, packs itself very tightly, and then shoots out. And this is somebody winding in all the energy that he's got and packing it so tightly that it must shoot out. Now, the part of it that is winding in is female, and the part that is shooting out is male. And there is no being that hasn't got energy winding in and shooting out. This means that every being is an hermaphrodite. You'll find that all the great religions will tell you that the human being is a hermaphrodite. He is a male-female. Remember that the absolute power is sentient power. It comes in and feels itself coming in, winds around, feels itself coming to being restricted, to pack itself into the centre, to get hotter and hotter, tighter and tighter, and more under the necessity of letting it out. It must let it out because the closure is necessarily finite. And at the moment of letting out, it is male. And thus is going on continuously. Now, factually, in our body, we have the power, because we're not different from this absolute sentient power, we have the power of identifying with any part of the function. If we identify with the indrawing, the to me buffaloes, as they say in the Girl Guides or Scouts, this to me function, we are being female. If we identify with the to you function, we are male. And this is the only difference. Now, as far as we're concerned empirically, we know of many cases of women turning into men. We know of no cases authenticated of a man regressing into a woman. Let's see why not. The force of the absolute comes in and starts to turn. So the state of woman is prior to the state of man. It cannot squirt out until it has been packed in. So the whole process of the inpacking of the energy in the time process is prior to the shooting out. So if the shooting out in a straight line and the, to me, the circle, are considered as temporal events, then the circle itself is seen temporarily to be prior to the straight line. But we see immediately that because the circle is derived from the straight line motion of the absolute prior to closure, that the absolute is absolutely male. As soon as we say that the to me finitely means female, we have to say that the absolute translating power is male. This is why we say God the Father and not God the Mother. The absolute force travelling along is male. It is pushing through infinite space. When it turns, it becomes female. And it will carry on being female until it has packed into itself so much that it will shoot out again. Now, biologically, it happens to be a fact. It's a physiological fact that every man has been a woman. Every man has been a child, and a child in utero has actually been a female before it was a male. The male genitalia have actually been inside the body before they came out. This means that every man has been a woman. But before the force could shoot out, there was a time before it had to shoot out. At that time, the stress was on the to me. Now it's quite easy to see why this should be so. The child inside the mother must say, "to me," for a long time. To get the energy to grow, it says "to me" very quickly, gets very well fed, well informed, and packs lots and lots of energy inside it. It will increase its heat and the necessity for discharge. This piling in of energy we call the movement towards tumescence. After tumescence occurs ejaculation. But the ejaculation cannot occur unless the tumescence reaches its term. So the energy drawn in by the developing child in utero goes on to a certain level, and if it gets sufficient of it, it becomes a he. But if it doesn't get sufficient, it still has an appetite for more. Now, imagine a being thrown into the world which has started the process and not completed it. Well, that's a baby girl. Imagine a being that has started the process and has completed it, and this has become so strong in its consciousness that it has realized the virtue of aggression, of activity, as opposed to passivity. As soon as the being has actually experienced the superiority of activity over passivity, it will never go back. We cannot conceive of a being abandoning power once gained unless it is constrained to abandon it by a superior force. So that as soon as a being has become stressed on this active side, the aggressive side of its nature, the male side, it will not abandon that unless we strike on it with tremendous force from outside and knock it back and make it regress. We can never get it to abandon that completely because it will always have a mnemic trace of the value of the activity. So we can't get a man to regress completely to the level of a woman. We can treat men with hormones of a certain kind, which will make them a bit softer than they were. They might develop secondary characteristics of the female, but we can't make them abandon completely the masculinity they have derived. So for a female, and the fact that it hasn't reached the term of tumescence means it is still hungry. And it knows what it's hungry for. It is hungry for more energy so that it can pack in and shoot out and thus aggress or dictate the conditions of life outside. When it says in Genesis that the desire of a woman shall be to the man, it means quite simply that inside every woman there is a tendency, a desire, a movement towards increasing self-determination. Self-determination is that which occurs when the energy packed in shoots out and makes a universe of its own. Well, actually, if we take any center of energy which has come in at a certain frequency and condensed, that might be the sun in the solar system, the energy condenses, packs very tightly, becomes tumescent, reaches the limiting factor where more energy coming in, suddenly it explodes, shooting the energy out. The energy shoots out to a certain distance and then collapses on a new center. So all the energy shot out collapses on a new center. It's this kind of process that develops planets in the greater universe. That energy shot from centers of compression collapses onto new centers outside, so that the ejaculated energy of a sun falling at a certain distance onto a new gravity center has become self-determinate. That is, it is no longer dependent on the center from which it derived. It now proceeds to involve itself and generate a system from itself. And this is the ideal for all the beings there are in the whole of infinite space, that every being is pursuing absolute self-determinism. It's not an immoral thing, because morality or immorality is irrelevant to it. It is a necessary motion of the Absolute Spirit. The Absolute Spirit is infinite. It's not in any sense frightened of the generation of finite centers, because they can never overthrow it. But it continuously moves into centers formed, piles them in with energy in order to shoot out fresh energies, to fall onto gravity centers and make new beings. Every time it shoots onto a gravity center, it creates a new being, and the new being is unique. There are no two beings, not even identical twins, in the whole universe that are absolutely identical. This means that every being is peculiarly itself in its peculiar configuration, and therefore is absolutely justified. That is, justified by the absolute in existing in and for its own development. And from the relations of all these unique beings, the whole process of universal evolution is enhanced and made more valuable. Thank you. That completes Levels of Being by Eugene Halliday.